"Let her gasp," my daughter said, not under her breath the way cruelty sometimes hides itself, but plainly enough for the nurse to hear, plainly enough for the tiles to keep echoing it at me hours after the shift changed and the lights dimmed. And maybe that was the moment my lungs learned a new trick that wasn't in any pulmonologist's chart: how to swell with air that hurts like remembering. I am 81. My name is Esperanza, although everyone calls me Essie when they need something, and Mother when they want to sound righteous. I use a portable oxygen tank at night, and the little green cannula that makes strangers either pity me or look away. And I am telling you this from a narrow rented apartment above a laundromat where the hum of machines has become my metronome, the place I chose after I discovered, late as thunder, that the worst hunger is not for breath or bread, but for dignity, and that I had been living on crumbs of it for years. I keep the tank beside my bed like a polite metal dog, and I wheel it to the window in the mornings so the sun can find me, because if you don't offer yourself to the light in old age, it forgets your address. And there, in that small ritual of hoses and straps and a cup of watered-down coffee, I remember that I was not always the woman who needed forgiving for taking too long to stand up, that I once ran a kitchen that fed a neighborhood, that I once laughed so hard at my husband's jokes I thought I might never catch my breath for a better reason than rust in the lungs, that my daughter Ruth used to fall asleep on my chest when the asthma took her as a child, and I counted every inhale like a prayer bead. And isn't it strange how the pendulum swung until the prayers were for me, and she was the one counting, only not to save me, but to time how long it would take before I surrendered. I live alone now, which sounds like a punishment to people who have never carried the weight of someone else's expectations on their back long enough to grow a second spine. And the relief of having only the laundry machines to answer to is a sweetness I hadn't tasted since the year I turned 40 and went back to night classes. And I can tell you without shame that I prefer the company of quarters and lint to the company of voices that turn you into an obligation. This room is small and honest. Its windows fog the way old eyes do in winter and clear when the sun insists. And everything in it answers only to me, which is why the kettle whistles with a kind of pride, and the radio sings Spanish boleros when I tell it to, and falls respectfully silent when my chest begins that rattling that makes the neighbors slow on the stairs. And maybe if you saw me here, you would think I am fragile because my hands shake when I lift the oxygen tubing over my ears. But you would be wrong, because fragility is what they called me so they could press me flat. And what I am is a woman who knows the difference between being needed and being used. I keep my papers in a blue folder under the bed, medical directives, the new will, the list of medications in my own handwriting with the loops I can never make small, and sometimes I slide it out just to touch the edges, the way people touch photographs of saints, not because paper can save a life, but because it can save a story from being rewritten by whoever is loudest. It is astonishing how much silence you can survive if you are allowed to keep a pen. People will tell you betrayal arrives like a storm, a hard slam of weather that rattles the doors and ruins the Sunday roast, but mine did not. Mine was a slow drizzle of rearranged pills and missing envelopes and a tone of voice that always sounded like a helpful suggestion until you listened to the grammar of it and realized the subject of every sentence was your erasure. And perhaps that is why the sentence that began this memory shocked me more than the act that followed, because at least there was no more perfume on the lie, no more lace sewn onto the muzzle. I can still hear the hallway that day, the squeak of cheap rubber soles, the gossip of IV poles, the way Ruth's bracelets chimed like a tiny church wherever she pressed a boundary, and I can see her face the way I saw it reflected in the bathroom mirror when she leaned close to adjust the cannula, the face I made more times than I can count at midnight over cereal and algebra homework. And I think now that motherhood is a wound that scabs elegantly over, and nobody speaks of how easily a grown child can pick at it with two casual words. But I am not telling you this to make myself a martyr. I am telling you because if you are a woman who lived too long in the good graces of other people's needs, you will sooner or later have to decide whether your breath belongs to you. In the beginning, I told myself that Ruth was tired, that caregiving corrodes the softest hearts, that we were both learning a choreography neither of us wanted. And yes, I am generous enough to say those things even now, from my clean little room with the thrift store lamp and the pothos plant trying its best, because generosity is a habit you cannot unlearn, no matter how sharply the lesson turns. But generosity is not the same as surrender, and somewhere between the pharmacy receipts I wasn't allowed to see and the doctor she chose for me because he spoke efficiently, I felt the old music of my spine stiffen. I belong to the generation of women who say I'm fine when the house is on fire and then put out the flames with the hem of our nightgowns. And it makes us excellent in a crisis and terrible at recognizing when the crisis is our own life. So if you ask me why I stayed those extra weeks after the fall, when I could have insisted on rehabilitation elsewhere, I will tell you that long habits are heavier than broken hips, and love in our upbringing was a verb that meant cooking, agreeing, and apologizing first. I brought my apron to Ruth's condominium as if an apron were a passport. I folded dish towels and labeled freezer containers like a supplicant decorating a shrine, and I told myself each little correction she made to my movement, the way she lifted the spoon from my hand to stir, the way she changed the channel from the old telenovelas to her talk shows, the way she counted my steps out loud down the hallway, was concern, not conquest. There were days when she tucked the oxygen tubing behind my ear with a tenderness that tasted like the past, and then there were the days when her mouth went thin if I asked for an extra pillow, and the thinness would stay even when she was smiling at the neighbor. And this is how you know you're in trouble: when your body begins to learn the weather of one person's face better than it knows the weather outside. I tell you these small domestic geographies because they are the map that leads to the single border I was born to defend and failed for too long to notice, the line where my breath and the right to spend it meet someone else's idea of efficiency. The afternoon the physical therapist praised my progress, and I asked, politely, always politely, if we could move the oxygen tank closer to the recliner so I could read in the window light. Ruth laughed as if I had requested a piano, and later she told the therapist I got confused with distances, and I signed the clipboard with a careful hand while my name looked at me like a disappointed aunt. And I thought, this is how it begins, not with a slap, not with a stolen wallet, but with a story told about you in the third person while you are standing there in the first. Nights were the worst, because night has always magnified whispers into verdicts, and when the condo went quiet and the refrigerator clicked its lonely tongue and the city outside performed its siren lullaby, I lay awake and counted breaths the way I used to count coins for rent, and I promised myself, quietly so the promise would fit in my chest, that if one more line was crossed, I would find the door with or without the walker. The day I left for this little apartment, the sky over the laundromat had a color I can only describe as forgiving, a blue that didn't pretend to be endless, and perhaps that is why I like it here. Nothing lies to me, not the mirror, not the neighbors, not the man downstairs who smokes on the loading dock and nods like a priest each time I pass, and not the plant that droops when I forget to water it and perks up when I remember myself again. I keep the oxygen flowing as the doctor ordered. I keep a notebook of questions for my next appointment. I keep a postcard of the sea taped to the cupboard, because sometimes I need to remember that bodies are allowed to be loud and moving and uncontained. And I keep one photo on the dresser, not of Ruth as a baby, though there is a part of me that will always ache for the little girl who slept on my chest and drooled sanctity into my blouse, but of my granddaughter Lila, reading with her mouth open in wonder, because astonishment is the only inheritance worth chasing, and because astonishment, unlike money, does not turn children into auditors of their elders' usefulness. I am telling you this now, before I speak of that bathroom and the lock and the hiss that went silent, because every story about a woman like me is eager to run to the moment of spectacle, the gasp, the door, the mercy that did not come. But the truth is, the gasp began years before the handle turned. It began when I answered to nicknames that made me small, when I learned to explain myself for the comfort of the comfortable, when I signed the holiday checks with a little heart because I thought sweetness would buy me safety. I am done with that arithmetic. So take this as the first breath of a different calculation, measured not by how well I behave in other people's houses, but by how faithfully I tend the house of myself. My living room smells like laundry steam and eucalyptus oil that I rub on my wrists when memory stings. My table wobbles unless you find the right place to press. My chair faces the window because I have decided to be looked at by the day. And on the sill, I keep a ceramic bird my husband once won for me at a fair, an ugly, precious thing that reminds me love is an act, not a certificate. I am 81, and I am not delicate, though I am breakable the way all good things are. And if Ruth were here, I would tell her, gently, because there is power in refusing to mirror what harmed you, that there are nights when the body you were born into becomes a courtroom, and the verdict is delayed again and again until you stand up and bang your own gavel. The night she said what she said, I learned how to stand, and the morning after, I learned how to leave. But that is for later. For now, you only need to know that the woman in this chair with the plastic lines on her face from sleeping wrong and the plastic lines under her nose for breathing right is not an artifact in anyone's museum of sacrifices. She is a live thing, listening to the machines below her spin and to the kettle whistle and to her own lungs write their slow script. And if you lean in close, you can hear the sentence she repeats to herself each dawn like a psalm. I will not apologize for air. I remember the evening exactly because the house smelled of bleach and oranges, that artificial cleanliness Ruth preferred, the kind that burns the back of your throat and makes you think of hospitals rather than homes. It was late April, the air thick and lukewarm, and my chest had been heavy all day from the pollen outside, but Ruth had insisted on opening every window to air things out, as if air could be made obedient by command. I had finished my soup, the kind of thin broth she called low sodium, and I called punishment, and I was about to shuffle toward the bedroom when she appeared in the doorway with that smile she used for company, not family, and said she wanted to help me take a shower. I told her I could manage. She said, "It's easier if we do it my way, Mother." That word, mother, came out of her mouth the way a nurse says patient, and I knew resistance was a wasted breath. The bathroom light was too bright, the tiles white and merciless, the kind that make every sound echo, and the mirror was already fogged from the steam she liked to start before the water even touched me. She adjusted the portable tank, checked the tubing, and for a moment her face softened, or maybe I imagined it, because the softness was something I needed to see. Then her husband called from the living room, something about paperwork, and she sighed, said she'd be right back, and I thought, good, a minute alone to undress slowly, to keep my dignity in the small rituals of care. I heard her heels click away down the hall, heard a low murmur of voices, and then the latch clicked behind me. Not the polite kind of click that means privacy, the hollow, final kind that means you've been enclosed. At first I thought it was a mistake, that she'd shut the door absent-mindedly. I reached for the knob, twisted, and felt the resistance of the lock turned from the outside. My heart jumped, not in panic, but in disbelief. I knocked once, then twice, calling her name with the tone I used to call her to dinner when she was 10. The voices on the other side lowered, then sharpened. Through the door I heard her say, "She needs to calm down. She's impossible when she panics. Give her a minute." Then the voice of her husband, flat and unimpressed, saying, "You're the one who said she's manipulating you." There was a pause, long enough for the sound of my own breathing to fill the room, and then Ruth said, clearly, almost bored, "Let her gasp. Maybe then she'll listen." I can still hear the timbre of that sentence, the way the air around it changed, the way it landed on the tiles like a verdict. Something in me stopped moving. It was not fear, not yet. It was the stunned recognition that someone you love can sound that calm while sentencing you to silence. The steam was still rising from the shower head she had left running, and the warmth mixed with the hiss of the oxygen that had always comforted me. But then the hiss stuttered, the way a candle does when there's no more wick. I looked down at the tank. She had turned the valve closed, maybe only halfway, maybe completely, I couldn't tell. But the line that fed my lungs went slack. For a second, the world blurred, not from lack of oxygen, but from the sudden awareness that this was not an accident. I remember leaning against the sink, the porcelain cool and solid, the only honest thing in the room. I tried the knob again, banged once, and when no one answered, I let myself slide down to the floor, because standing took too much, and I thought, is this how it ends? Not with a hospital monitor, not with prayer, but with someone's impatience. My mind, traitorous as always, began cataloging mundane things. The drip of the faucet, the sound of a car door outside, the scent of orange cleaner, the wet towel folded too neatly on the rack. The body has strange ways of distracting itself from death. When the dizziness came, it was soft, like a tide rather than a wave. I pressed my palm to the tile, felt its coldness, and that coldness anchored me. I thought of Lila, my granddaughter, her hair smelling of library books and wind, how she used to press her ear to my chest and say, "Grandma, you sound like an accordion." I thought of the first time Ruth had an asthma attack at 6, how I had held her upright in the night, counted every breath, whispered, "In, my love, out, my love," until the medicine worked. The irony of it all made me want to laugh, but the air was too thin for laughter. Somewhere beyond the door, a television started playing, a game show, the laughter of strangers, the applause track of the indifferent. I remember thinking that if I could just crawl closer to the door, maybe the noise would keep me awake. I moved inch by inch, dragging the small tank with me, though it was no longer giving anything, the metal wheels clicking softly on the tile. The lock above me glinted like an unblinking eye. I whispered her name once more, not as a plea, but as a fact, like naming a storm. Ruth. Nothing. I was dizzy enough that her silence sounded like distance. I managed to reach the base of the door, and in that small motion, something inside me rebelled against ending here. I found my voice again, thin but sharp, and shouted, "Open it now!" The sound startled even me. It was my old nurse's voice, the one that used to make stubborn interns stop talking. Footsteps returned, hesitant. The handle moved, then paused. I heard a sigh, the lock clicked open, and the door swung halfway. She stood there, framed in the steam, mascara smudged, mouth tight, and for a heartbeat, she looked not cruel, but frightened of what she'd almost done. I didn't speak. I reached forward, turned the valve back on myself, and the hiss returned, a sound so pure it was almost music. She said something about misunderstanding, about how the tank had jammed, but her eyes were too dry for that to be true. I sat there breathing through the hiss, letting it fill the space between us until she backed away. When I finally stood, slowly, every joint protesting, I said, "You will never lock another door behind me." She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. Later that night, she pretended to check my vitals and left a cup of tea on the bedside table, a peace offering that tasted of guilt. I drank it anyway, because survival is sometimes the pettier form of forgiveness. The next morning, the house was quiet. She had gone to work early, leaving a note on the counter. "Didn't mean to scare you. Please rest." No signature. I looked at the note, folded it twice, and tucked it into my robe pocket. Evidence, I told myself, though I wasn't yet sure of what. The sunlight coming through the kitchen blinds made little stripes on the floor, like bars on a cage that only I could see. My hands trembled when I reached for the oxygen valve, not from weakness, but from a new, thin fury. I had been a nurse for 30 years. I knew the fragility of breath, the line between care and cruelty. That line had been crossed cleanly, and now every inhale I took in her house felt borrowed. Around noon she called, her voice overly bright. "How are you feeling, Mother?" I said, breathing. She laughed nervously, said something about picking up my prescription later. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and made myself write down everything: the time, the words, the lock, the sound of the valve. I wrote as if I were charting a patient. Maybe I was. I kept that page folded under the napkin holder for a week, my private record of the moment the world tipped. In the evenings, she behaved as if nothing had happened, fussed about dinner, reminded me to use the walker. Her husband barely looked at me. The house became a stage where all of us knew the script had changed, but no one dared to improvise. Sleep came in fragments. I began waking at 3 a.m., heart pounding, listening for the sound of the lock, the shuffle of feet outside my door. Once I caught her standing in the hallway, just standing, holding her phone, light from the screen ghosting her face. When she saw me watching, she smiled and said, "Couldn't sleep." I nodded and closed my door. The next day, I found my mail unopened in the recycling bin. My bank statement had been slid open and resealed with tape. I told myself maybe she was organizing things for me. Maybe she was worried. That's what daughters do, isn't it? Worry. But worry does not make people hide your oxygen refills in a cupboard and tell the supplier they'll handle the scheduling themselves. 2 days after the bathroom incident, the social worker from my insurance plan called to verify new contact details. When I asked what she meant, she said, "Your daughter requested to be listed as primary caregiver and medical proxy." I felt something inside me settle into place. Not despair, not fear, but a quiet, professional kind of clarity. The kind nurses get when a patient's chart doesn't match the symptoms and you realize someone has been lying. I thanked the woman, hung up, and opened the blue folder where I kept my documents. The will, the account numbers, the living directive, all still there, for now. I put the folder under my pillow that night, the way children sleep with treasures. In the morning, Ruth came into my room without knocking, carrying a tray of toast and pills. "You really should let me take care of these," she said, reaching for the folder. I smiled at her, the way one smiles at a hostile stranger. "You have enough to carry, darling," I said, keeping my hand on it. She hesitated, then shrugged, said she was only trying to help. I watched her leave, and that was the moment, though I didn't know it yet, when I decided to stop surviving quietly. The lock on the bathroom had taught me what silence buys. More locks. The folder was my air now, the oxygen they couldn't turn off, and I was not going to let it out of my sight again. From that morning on, the house learned a new silence, the kind that hums beneath ordinary sounds, the silence of people pretending there is no wound as long as no one mentions the blood. Ruth moved around me with careful choreography, her heels muffled on the carpet, her voice carrying that brittle politeness reserved for strangers in waiting rooms. She started leaving notes instead of speaking, small square papers on the refrigerator and bedside table, reminders about appointments, prescriptions, times to rest, each one signed with a heart that looked drawn by obligation, not affection. I followed the notes the way a dog follows a leash, not because I trusted them, but because I needed to measure how much of my world she was still trying to own. The oxygen tank became my clock. Each hiss marked the minutes between her departures and her returns, and in those intervals, I learned the geography of control. She had moved the tank to the far side of the living room, next to the window where the curtains stayed closed, and each time I wanted to adjust it, I had to ask. She said it was too heavy for me. She said it was for my safety. She said many things that sounded like care, but felt like fences. The first week after the lock, I noticed my mail stopped arriving. I asked about it casually over dinner, and Ruth said, "I'm having it forwarded to make things simpler." I asked, "Simpler for whom?" She smiled without looking up from her phone. "For everyone." Later, when I checked the small table in the hall where the mail used to sit, I found only junk flyers. My pension statement, my insurance summary, even the letter from my church, they vanished. The drawers began to rearrange themselves when I wasn't looking. The pills that once sat in a neat row by the sink were now in a plastic organizer labeled by color instead of day. And when I questioned her about it, she said, "You keep forgetting doses. This way it's idiot-proof." The word slipped out like a reflex, and she didn't notice or pretended not to. I said nothing. Silence, I discovered, is not the absence of power. It is the collection of it, waiting for the right moment to spend. Days blurred into a soft gray repetition of monitored kindness. The house smelled perpetually of antiseptic wipes and citrus air freshener, a laboratory of cleanliness that erased any trace of living. The television, which I used to watch in the afternoons, now stayed tuned to her channels: financial news, self-improvement gurus, shows about decluttering your life. When I tried to change the station, the remote batteries were mysteriously dead. "Small things," she would say if accused, "just small things." But small things are how erosion begins. The first cliff never notices the tide until it's gone. Sometimes, when she thought I was asleep, she would stand in the doorway, whispering to someone on the phone. Her tone had that half-patient, half-victim rhythm I knew too well. "It's not easy. She refuses help. You know how stubborn old people get. We're doing what's best." The pronoun we always meant she had already recruited someone, her husband perhaps, or a lawyer. I lay still, letting the words crawl over me like insects, each one another theft of truth. By day she offered tea. By night she rewrote my story. On the 10th day, she suggested hiring a home manager, a polite term for babysitter. "It'll give you more independence," she said, twisting logic into kindness. "You'll have someone to help with errands while I'm at work." I asked, "Do I need permission to leave my own kitchen now?" She sighed. "You're taking everything personally." I wanted to laugh because personal was exactly what it was, the slow displacement of my personhood. The next morning, a stranger arrived, a woman in a pale uniform with a clipboard and a smile that belonged to customer service. "Just here to help," she chirped, and began rearranging my medicine again, checking labels as if I couldn't read. Ruth introduced her as Candace, our helper, as though I had requested her. Candace called me Ms. Harlow, the way nurses do when they've been told you're confused. I played along, polite, compliant, taking note of everything she touched. When she left, I found my blue folder had been moved from the nightstand to the dresser. Not stolen, just handled, like an object under evaluation. That night, I slept with it under my pillow again. Each day, the walls seemed to lean closer. The hallway, once bright with family photos, now felt like a tunnel. She had taken down the pictures of my late husband and replaced them with prints of abstract art, all beige swirls and black lines. "It feels more modern," she said. The faces that knew me were boxed away in the attic, and I could almost hear them whispering above the ceiling. At meals, she started controlling portions. "Too much sodium," she'd say, scraping half my plate into the trash. When I began losing weight, she complimented me, as if shrinking were an achievement. Her husband nodded approvingly, muttering about discipline. I recognized that tone. It was the language of ownership disguised as praise. The worst was the evenings. She would pour herself wine and sit across from me, her glass catching the light, and begin to talk about plans. She spoke in the future tense, a future where I existed only as a line item in her schedule. "Once we sort the legal stuff, we can relax," she'd say, or, "The bank said it's just a formality, nothing to worry about." I asked what form she meant. She brushed it off. "You don't need to read everything. I've got it handled." She had forgotten that I once handled lives for a living, that my eyes had read charts and consent forms and discharge summaries until they knew the smell of deceit. One evening I told her, "I would like to see the paperwork myself." Her face froze. "You don't trust me?" "I trust facts," I said. She smiled, that tight, dangerous smile I'd seen on patients before a breakdown. "You really should rest more." The following day, the oxygen delivery didn't arrive. When I asked about it, she said there had been a delay, that she was switching suppliers for better rates. By nightfall, the tank was nearly empty. I turned the valve off between breaths to conserve it. That rhythm, the deliberate cutting of air, became my meditation, my rehearsal for patience. Around midnight, she came in, saw me sitting awake, and said, "Don't make everything dramatic." I looked at her, at the woman who once called me Mommy with the soft vowels of childhood, and said quietly, "Drama needs an audience. I only have witnesses." She didn't understand. She rarely did. I began small rebellions. When she went to work, I walked through the house touching my things, reclaiming them with fingerprints. I moved the blue folder each day to a new hiding place, the linen closet, the freezer, under the seat cushion, so that even if she searched, she would not know where to look twice. I kept a notepad in my robe pocket where I recorded dates, times, conversations, the colors of lies. I called it my oxygen diary because each word I wrote felt like a breath she couldn't steal. One afternoon, while dusting the bookshelf, I found a printed brochure tucked behind a vase. Transition Care, Preparing Loved Ones for End-of-Life Decisions. My name was written in pencil on the corner. I stared at it for a long time. The paper felt heavier than it should. When I confronted her, she laughed. "You're being paranoid. It's informational." I said, "About whose life?" She rolled her eyes. "Stop with the melodrama. You always make things about you." I wanted to tell her that making things about yourself is the first step toward survival, but I knew she'd only hear defiance. That night, I dreamed of doors. Every door I tried to open led to another hallway lined with mirrors, and in each reflection, my mouth was covered by an oxygen mask made of glass. I woke up gasping, though the tank was full. The next morning, she announced she'd scheduled a medical evaluation. "Routine cognitive check," she said. "Just a formality." The doctor was young, kind-eyed, and careful with his questions. He asked me to draw a clock, to recall 3 words, to name the president. I did it all. When Ruth stepped out to take a phone call, he leaned closer and whispered, "You seem perfectly competent, ma'am. Is everything all right here?" I looked at him, at his earnest face, and thought of the risk he'd take if I told him the truth. I said, "Everything is as it appears." It was the safest lie I've ever told. After that visit, Ruth grew colder. The pretense of affection faded. She began talking over me in front of others, delivery men, neighbors, the home manager. "She gets confused," she'd say, laughing softly. "Don't mind her." Each time she said it, I felt myself evaporate a little more from the room. People stopped asking me direct questions. They asked her instead, "Does she need anything? Is she up for visitors?" I watched myself become a rumor of an old woman. It was almost impressive how quickly invisibility spread once someone else started narrating your life. But invisibility has its privileges. While she believed I was fading, I was learning. I memorized her routines, the hour she left for work, the password she used on the computer, the drawer where she kept envelopes from the bank. I never touched them, but I needed to know. Knowledge, like oxygen, must be stored in case of emergency. Sometimes I caught myself humming while I made tea, the tune of an old lullaby I used to sing to her. The irony didn't escape me. I was soothing myself to sleep with the same melody that once kept her alive. By the end of that month, the house no longer felt like a home, but like an exhibit. Elderly woman in controlled habitat. Every object had its label, every action a supervisor. Even the air seemed rationed. Yet in that confinement, something shifted. I began to sense a quiet strength returning, not the youthful kind that shouts and demands, but the kind that sits still and watches patterns. Ruth thought she had diminished me. What she had done was focus me. Each breath through the tube became an act of inventory. What I still owned, what I still remembered, what I could still choose. And beneath all the control, I could feel it coming. The moment when her order would crack under its own weight, when I would stop asking for air and start taking it back. The turning point did not announce itself with thunder. It arrived in the quietest hour of morning, the one when the light outside the blinds has the color of paper before ink, when the house still believes it is alone with its secrets. I had woken early because I dreamed of a door again, but this time it opened. I sat up slowly, the oxygen tube making its faint hiss beside me, and for the first time in weeks, I felt not fear, but focus, the kind that comes when a long calculation finally balances in your mind. The night before, Ruth had forgotten to close the drawer of her desk in the living room, and when she went upstairs to bathe, I had seen, just for an instant, the edge of an envelope I recognized. My name, written in my own hand, on a letter I had mailed 2 months earlier to the insurance office about my pension adjustment. It had been returned, unopened, stamped, address changed. I hadn't changed anything. I waited until the morning to act because patience, I'd learned, was the only power that could live quietly without suspicion. When the house was still, I rolled my oxygen tank to the desk, careful not to let the wheels squeak. The envelope was there, along with a folder half closed, heavy with papers. My hands, though tremoring, were steady enough to slide it open. Inside were documents with the smell of official paper, legal drafts, bank forms, letters from a lawyer I didn't know. The first page stopped me cold, a power of attorney authorization with my name printed beneath hers, and a signature that looked like mine but wasn't. The handwriting was close, practiced. Someone had copied me well. I turned the page and saw my bank listed, my pension account, my medical directive, each one marked with the phrase, "to be consolidated under family care." The phrase sounded harmless, almost bureaucratic, but I understood the meaning. It meant control, full and irrevocable. It meant I would breathe only when allowed. I didn't cry. The tears had burned themselves out in smaller humiliations long ago. Instead, I found myself looking at the handwriting on the forged signature. I traced the pen marks lightly with my fingertip, wondering whether she had practiced on scrap paper, whether she had felt nervous or excited, whether she had told herself she was doing something noble. I closed the folder, replaced it exactly as it was, and returned to my room. My reflection in the dresser mirror looked calm, almost indifferent, but my pulse beat in my throat like a second clock. There was no use in confrontation. She would lie, and I would waste the breath I still had. The only reasonable thing left was to prepare. That morning over breakfast, Ruth seemed brighter than usual, humming as she spread avocado on her toast. "You'll be happy to know I took care of some of your paperwork," she said. "Less stress for you." I asked what paperwork. She waved her hand. "Just bills and banking nonsense. You can thank me later." She smiled, that sharp smile that didn't touch the eyes, and sipped her coffee. I nodded and said, "I appreciate you keeping things organized." The words tasted like iron. She mistook my calm for submission and left for work without locking the cabinet this time. That was her mistake. When the door closed, I waited 5 minutes, then pulled out my phone, the one she didn't know I still had. Months earlier, I'd slipped the SIM card from an old device into a cheap prepaid model I kept hidden in the lining of my handbag. It had been my small insurance against isolation, though I hadn't used it yet. Now I scrolled through my contacts and stopped at a name I hadn't said aloud in years, Clara Mendoza. We had trained together at the hospital in our 20s. She'd gone into legal nursing after retiring, sharp as ever, the kind of woman who knew which lines in a form could destroy a life. I dialed, not expecting her to answer on the first ring, but she did. "Essie?" she said, her voice half disbelief, half delight. I swallowed the sudden thickness in my throat and said, "Clara, I need advice. Quiet advice." She listened without interrupting as I told her about the folder, the lock, the signature. When I finished, there was a long pause, the kind that hums with thought rather than judgment. "You're competent," she said finally. "That's all that matters. Competent people can protect themselves. Do you have identification?" I told her I did. "Then come see me," she said. "Tomorrow. Bring everything." She gave me the address of her small office downtown, above a bakery, and told me to tell no one. Not even your doctor, especially not her. The next morning, I dressed carefully, choosing the blouse Ruth called too formal, and the wool skirt that still carried the scent of mothballs and my former self. I left before Ruth returned from her run, dragging the oxygen tank behind me like a reluctant pet. I called a taxi from the end of the block so she wouldn't hear the engine. The driver, a man about my age with a soft accent, didn't ask questions. When he offered to carry the tank, I thanked him but kept my grip. Trust was a currency I was no longer rich in. The city looked different from behind the glass, smaller and louder, the kind of place where stories like mine were invisible until they made headlines. When we stopped, I paid in cash, the money I'd been saving from my pension withdrawals, the ones she didn't know about. Clara's office was small, lined with file cabinets and old medical journals, but it smelled like sanity, paper, coffee, and responsibility. She hugged me carefully, mindful of the tubing. "You look thinner," she said, "but awake." I handed her the folder I had copied on my small printer the night before, every page scanned and hidden on a flash drive in the lining of my purse. She read in silence, her glasses sliding down her nose. When she finished, she said, "This is forgery, and it's elder abuse. You can fight this, but you have to do it cleanly." She laid out a plan: notarize a statement of competence, transfer my accounts to a new bank, revoke any existing powers of attorney, and appoint a new contact, someone she trusted to witness it. "Do you have anyone you'd choose?" she asked. I thought of Lila, my granddaughter, away at college in another state. She was young, but she still called me on holidays, still sent postcards in her handwriting rather than typed messages. "I have one person," I said, "but I'll wait until the paperwork is done." For 2 hours we filled forms. My hand shook while signing, but not enough to invalidate them. She notarized everything, stamped with the kind of precision that makes even the cruelest bureaucracy yield. When we were done, she leaned back and said, "Essie, you need to get out of that house, today if possible." I told her I couldn't yet. There were things to retrieve, my photographs, my mother's ring, the documents she hadn't found. Clara sighed. "You have 1 week, no more. After that you call me, and we'll move you somewhere safe." I left her office lighter, though the oxygen tank still hissed faithfully by my side. On the street, the air smelled of bread and bus exhaust, both equally alive. I walked half a block before realizing I wasn't tired. My lungs ached, but not in despair, in effort, and effort is its own kind of grace. I bought a croissant from the bakery downstairs, the first pastry I'd eaten in months, and sat on a bench, watching people hurry past me without knowing they were witnessing a resurrection. Each bite tasted of disobedience. When I returned home that afternoon, Ruth was in the kitchen, her phone on speaker, laughing too loudly. She looked startled when she saw me. "Where have you been?" she demanded. "Out," I said. "I needed air." She frowned. "You should have told me. I was worried." "Were you?" I asked, not unkindly. Her eyes narrowed. "Don't start." I wheeled the tank past her, up the hallway to my room. I could feel her gaze follow me, heavy with suspicion. But suspicion is a weak weapon against someone who no longer cares to hide. That evening, I sat at my small desk and wrote a letter to Lila. I didn't mention the lock or the documents. I simply told her I was thinking of her, that I'd been reading the poetry book she sent, that the violets in the garden had bloomed early. At the bottom I wrote, "Never let anyone sign your name for you. It's a theft too quiet to notice until it's done." Then I folded it neatly, addressed it by hand, and placed it in the outgoing mail slot. It was the first letter I'd sent that no one had read before me. The next days moved with deceptive calm. Ruth acted almost affectionate, cooking my favorite soup, bringing me magazines, asking about my sleep. I let her perform. Each act of kindness was another lie I could catalog. On the third morning, she mentioned the lawyer again. "He'll come by next week to finalize some things," she said. "It'll make your life easier." I nodded, smiling into my cup of tea. "I like things easy," I said. She seemed satisfied. She didn't notice that my suitcase was already packed, that my identification, the new bank card, and Clara's business card were zipped inside. I began spending afternoons by the window, pretending to nap, but actually watching the street, memorizing the rhythm of traffic, the sound of the mail truck, the time the sunlight hit the porch. I would need to know these details when I left. The house no longer frightened me. It felt like a set waiting for the curtain to fall. I caught Ruth watching me sometimes, her eyes sharp, calculating, as if trying to decide whether the performance of daughterly care was still necessary. I smiled at her each time, the smile of a woman who has already walked out in her mind. The shift was complete the morning I realized I no longer thought of myself as her patient. I was her witness, and witnesses survive. I had seen the machinery of control from the inside, understood its levers, and learned how to slip between them. Every breath I took now was evidence. Every signature she forged was a confession she hadn't yet written. When she told me to rest, I rested. When she told me to eat, I ate. When she told me she loved me, I said, "I know." The words meant nothing, but they sounded right enough to keep her calm. In that calm, I built my escape quietly, like a nurse preparing a syringe, one measured motion at a time. By the end of that week, my decision was not a plan, but a certainty. I would walk out with my papers, my ring, and my name, and I would not look back. The day I did, she would still be telling someone on the phone that I was confused, that she was trying her best. Maybe she believed it. Maybe she needed to. But the truth was simpler. She had mistaken my breath for her inheritance, and now I was taking it back. I knew the peace I'd built was fragile, the kind that trembles if you breathe too loudly. It held together for almost a week, until one afternoon when the clouds hung low enough to press the house into a silence that felt rehearsed. Ruth had gone out early, leaving her phone charging on the kitchen counter. I was in the living room, folding the cardigan she'd thrown carelessly over a chair when the device lit up. The screen showed a preview of a text from an unfamiliar number. "Power of attorney package ready. Need final signature and witness confirmation. Thursday latest." The words hit me like the shock of cold water. My first instinct was to turn away, to pretend I hadn't seen it, to keep breathing quietly in my little corner of peace. But some instincts are too late once knowledge enters the blood. I took the phone, read the message again, and placed it back exactly where it was. There it was, confirmation of what I'd already known. My small acts of self-preservation had not gone unnoticed. They had provoked her to accelerate her plans. The daughter who once refused to sleep without my lullaby was now scheduling the legal burial of my autonomy, complete with witnesses. That afternoon, I called Clara from the hallway while pretending to check the thermostat. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was clipped and steady, the way professionals speak when emotion would cost them time. "She's close," I said. "They're finalizing it this week." Clara inhaled audibly, then said, "Do not confront her. Let her finish digging her own hole. We'll need evidence. When exactly?" "Thursday," I said. "I don't know the hour." "Then you stay still until Thursday," she said. "Keep the documents safe. If you can, record something, a conversation, a message, anything that shows intent. Then call me. I'll handle the rest." I thanked her, hung up, and went back to the living room, where the oxygen tank hummed its steady rhythm, the only thing in that house still loyal to me. Ruth came home an hour later, humming off key as she carried in grocery bags, her voice so falsely casual that I could smell the performance before she even crossed the threshold. "Mother," she called, "could you give me a hand with the pantry?" I wheeled the tank toward the kitchen. She was unpacking canned goods, soups, beans, everything low sodium and joyless, and talking too fast about how busy she'd been. Then she stopped mid-sentence, reached for her phone, and realized it had been moved. She looked up at me, her eyes sharp. "Did you touch this?" she asked. I kept folding the empty grocery bag, my hands steady. "I was wiping the counter," I said. "Maybe it shifted." She watched me for a moment longer than politeness allows, then smiled, small and tight. "You should rest," she said. "You've been anxious lately." I smiled back, "Only when there's reason." That night I didn't sleep. I sat up in bed, the oxygen line tracing pale arcs across my lap, thinking about how betrayal evolves, not in leaps, but in slow, cunning increments, until one day you find yourself living inside someone else's version of your life. I thought of Ruth at 6, clutching her inhaler, crying because she couldn't breathe, and me sitting beside her counting the seconds between gasps. Now the roles had reversed with cruel symmetry. She was the one holding the air, deciding when I could have it. I wondered what turned love into this. Maybe it wasn't hate, but hunger. Hunger for control, for certainty, for proof that she had become more than my daughter, that she could rewrite the script of our lives. The irony was that in trying to control my ending, she had given me a new beginning. I decided then that I would let Thursday come. I would let her believe she had won, because sometimes the only way to escape a cage is to convince the warden to open it herself. The days that followed were theater. She cooked elaborate meals I couldn't eat, arranged flowers I hadn't asked for, hovered with a sweetness that made the air thick. "You'll feel better soon," she kept saying, and her husband echoed her, nodding like a puppet in the background. I answered politely, even thanked them. On Wednesday night, she told me a friend from the bank would be stopping by the next day to review routine financial updates. Her tone was rehearsed, the kind of calm you use when speaking to a child. "You don't need to worry about a thing, Mother," she said. "I'll handle the details. You just sign where they tell you." I nodded, and she mistook my compliance for surrender. "Good," she said, patting my hand. "You see, everything's under control." Her words, meant to soothe, were a confession. When she went upstairs, I opened my dresser drawer and took out the small audio recorder Clara had sent me by courier 2 days earlier. It looked like a pen, ordinary and harmless. I placed it on the table next to my chair, pressed the button until the red light blinked, and left it there. If Ruth wanted a performance, she would have one. Thursday morning came draped in a dull light, the kind of gray that flattens everything into monotony. I dressed carefully, as if for church, and sat in the armchair near the window. The oxygen hissed faintly beside me, a soft percussion to my waiting. At 9:10, Ruth's car pulled into the driveway. She wasn't alone. A man in a dark suit stepped out, carrying a briefcase. His face had the practiced neutrality of professionals who deal in signatures and inheritance. They entered together, Ruth smiling too brightly. "Mother, this is Mr. Sanders," she said. "He's here to help us update some documents." He nodded politely, addressing me the way one addresses a patient whose comprehension is in question. "Just a few formalities, ma'am. Your daughter has explained everything." I gestured for them to sit. Ruth placed a stack of papers on the coffee table, sliding them toward me like offerings. "Here we are," she said softly. "These are just updates, banking, medical consent, all the routine end-of-life things." The phrase made my stomach clench. Mr. Sanders opened his briefcase, took out a folder, and began pointing to various lines. "Here, if you could initial," he said, tapping with his pen. I leaned forward, feigning the slow confusion she expected. "Could you read that section to me?" I asked. He obliged, reciting clauses about financial consolidation, representative authority, advance directive revisions. Each word was a theft dressed as efficiency. When he finished, I said, "And if I don't sign?" He blinked, caught off guard. "Well, that would delay things," he said carefully. "Your daughter—" "My daughter," I interrupted, "has been very helpful, but I prefer to understand what I'm signing." I looked at Ruth, who smiled through clenched teeth. "Mother," she said softly, "we've gone over this before." "Have we?" I asked. I must be forgetting again. I picked up the pen, the one shaped like a silver rod, identical to the recorder on the table. I clicked it once, pretending to test the ink, and then looked at Mr. Sanders. "Would you mind leaving these papers here so I can review them overnight?" He hesitated. Ruth's face hardened. "That's not necessary," she said. "He's on a schedule." "Then he'll come back tomorrow," I said. My tone was gentle but firm, the way I used to speak to difficult patients who believed pain was a sign of progress. The man looked from her to me and back again, unsure which authority to obey. "Perhaps we can—" he began, but Ruth cut him off. "Mother, please, you're tired. Let's not complicate this." She reached to take the papers, and I laid my hand flat on them. "You're right," I said. "I am tired. That's why I won't sign anything when I'm tired." The silence that followed was so thick it seemed to muffle even the hiss of the oxygen. Finally, the man cleared his throat. "I think it might be best if I return later," he said, and with a few awkward gestures, he gathered his things and left. The moment the door closed, Ruth turned on me. The sweetness evaporated. "What are you doing?" she hissed. "Do you have any idea how much work I've put into this?" Her voice broke on the last word. Anger and panic braided together. I sat back, calm. "Too much, it seems." "You're sabotaging yourself," she said. "These are protections. I'm trying to make sure you're safe." "From whom?" I asked. She blinked, thrown off by the question. From mistakes, from being taken advantage of." "Like now?" I said. Her hands trembled. "You don't understand," she said. "You're not well. You forget things. I'm doing what's best for you." I looked at her and saw it clearly. The desperate child beneath the cruelty, the one who needed to control me because she feared what would happen when I was gone. "You're right," I said softly. "I forget sometimes, but not everything." She stepped closer, her expression hardening again. "You're making this difficult," she said. "I'm not the enemy." I smiled, small and sad. "You're not the daughter I raised either." For a long moment she said nothing, then turned abruptly and stormed upstairs, the sound of her footsteps echoing like a verdict. I waited until I heard her door slam before I turned off the recorder and placed it back in my pocket. The file would be enough for Clara. That night, I packed quietly. I took the blue folder, the ring, a change of clothes, and the photograph of Lila reading under the oak tree. I didn't take much else. The rest of the house belonged to Ruth's version of my life, not mine. I slept in my clothes, the suitcase under the bed, the oxygen tank full. At dawn, I woke to the sound of her moving through the hallway. She knocked once, then opened the door without waiting. "We need to talk," she said. Her tone was flat, mechanical. "About what?" I asked. "About what happens next," she said. "You can't keep resisting. It's not healthy." I said nothing, just sat there adjusting the oxygen tube. "You've been calling people," she continued. "I saw the number in your call history. Who is Clara?" For a moment I froze, realizing she had gone through my phone. Then I exhaled slowly, the sound of the oxygen disguising the tremor in my breath. "A friend," I said, "an old one." "What does she want?" she asked. "Nothing you can give," I said. Her eyes narrowed. "You're being dramatic again." I met her gaze. "No, Ruth, I'm being awake." The words landed harder than I intended. She opened her mouth to retort, then closed it, shaking her head. "You're impossible," she said, and left. After she was gone, I called Clara. "It's time," I said. "I have what you need." She told me to meet her at the notary office that afternoon. I agreed, then sat for a long time in the quiet, feeling the house pulse around me like a living thing that was about to lose its host. Around noon, Ruth returned unexpectedly, face flushed, eyes glassy. "You're leaving, aren't you?" she said. Her voice cracked, half fury, half fear. "You think you can just walk out after everything I've done?" I stood, the oxygen tube trailing behind me, and said, "Yes." She laughed bitterly. "You can't even breathe without me." I looked at her, really looked, and for the first time felt no anger, only sorrow. "That's what you never understood," I said. "I was breathing before you were born." She lunged forward then, not to strike, but to grab the suitcase. The motion yanked the oxygen tube from my face, and the hiss of escaping air filled the room. For a heartbeat, we both froze, staring at each other, the sound like a verdict between us. Then I bent, reattached the line, and said quietly, "Let go." She did, and stepped back, trembling. "If you leave, don't come back," she said. "I won't," I replied. I left before she could speak again. The street outside was bright and merciless, the sky washed clean by a night of rain. I called a cab and told the driver to take me downtown. As the car pulled away, I looked once through the rear window. Ruth stood at the door, her figure small, almost childlike, framed by the house that had become her fortress and her prison. I thought I might feel triumph, but all I felt was release, like the moment after exhalation when your lungs are empty but ready again for air. At Clara's office, the recorder's file was downloaded, the statement notarized, the papers sealed. "You're free now," she said, "legally and otherwise." I nodded, though freedom, like breath, takes time to fill you. I spent that night in a small motel, the kind that smells of dust and detergent, and slept deeply for the first time in months. The next morning, I wrote one final note to Ruth. It said only, "I love you, but I will not be your oxygen anymore." Then I folded it, left it unsigned, and mailed it without a return address. The day everything ended began without drama. That, I suppose, was the true cruelty of it. How ordinary it all felt, how easily the world kept moving while one life quietly redrafted its ending. I woke to the pale hum of the oxygen machine and the rattle of the motel's air conditioner struggling against the heat. The curtains were half open, letting in a sliver of morning light the color of weak tea, and for a moment I thought I was back in Ruth's house, waiting for footsteps on the stairs. But then I saw the blue folder on the chair, my name printed neatly on its spine, and remembered that this room, plain and small as it was, belonged to me alone. I made myself sit up slowly, pressing the mask to my face and inhaling until the sound steadied. There was a quiet satisfaction in that hiss, steady, rhythmic, ungoverned. I made coffee with the little packet the motel provided, the kind that tastes like burnt intentions, and sat by the window with the cup warming my hands. I wasn't afraid, not anymore. I was past fear. What I felt was a strange mixture of exhaustion and readiness, as if all the waiting I had done for months had condensed into one long, inevitable exhale. Clara called at 8. Her voice, brisk as always, carried the promise of resolution. "Essie," she said, "it's all in motion. I filed the revocation notice and sent copies to the bank, the lawyer, and the insurance board. They'll receive them today." I asked what that meant in plain language. "It means she can't touch anything that's yours anymore," she said. "Not your accounts, not your records, not your name. You're protected now, but you'll need to sign the last set of documents in person." I asked where. "At the notary's office," she said. 3:00 sharp. I'll be there with the witnesses." I thanked her. "You've saved my life," I said. She laughed softly. "No, Essie, you did that yourself." After we hung up, I spent the morning in silence. I read the newspaper someone had left in the lobby, underlined an article about a local nursing strike, folded it neatly, and put it in my purse. Old habits die hard. Around noon, I took a slow shower, the hot water loosening the ache in my back, and dressed in my cleanest clothes, a cream blouse, a navy skirt, and the thin gold chain with my wedding ring strung through it. The reflection in the mirror startled me, not because of the wrinkles or the tired eyes, but because of the calm in them. I looked like a woman who had already crossed the river and was only waiting for her shoes to dry. The notary's office was downtown, in a small building wedged between a flower shop and an old bookstore. The driver helped me lift the oxygen tank onto the curb, and I thanked him with more sincerity than he could have guessed. Inside, Clara was waiting with 2 witnesses, both women about my age, one a retired nurse and the other a church secretary. They greeted me warmly, without pity. We sat at a long oak table that smelled faintly of lemon polish, and the notary, a tall man with kind eyes, spread out the papers. "We'll go through this step by step," he said. His voice reminded me of the priests who used to visit hospital wards, gentle but firm, as if he were guiding the dying toward confession. Clara explained each document carefully: the revocation of the old power of attorney, the declaration of competence signed by a doctor she trusted, the new will transferring everything directly to my granddaughter, Lila, and a letter instructing my bank to release control only to me. Each page was a quiet act of reclamation, every signature a piece of oxygen returned. My hand shook slightly as I signed, but I forced myself to slow down, to savor the motion of the pen. The sound of the nib scratching across paper was soft, steady, and final. When I finished the last line, Clara placed her hand over mine. "It's done," she said. "You're free." I should have felt relief, but what washed over me instead was grief, deep and clean. I hadn't cried since the night in the bathroom, but now the tears came quietly, not for myself, but for the daughter I had lost long before I left her house. The women stayed silent, giving me the dignity of weeping without comment. When I finally wiped my face, Clara said, "You're allowed to mourn her, you know. She's alive, but you can still mourn her." I nodded, because she was right. Some deaths come without funerals. After the paperwork was sealed and stamped, I left the office and stood on the sidewalk for a long time. The air was warm and smelled faintly of exhaust and gardenia from the flower shop next door. I took a long, deliberate breath, feeling it move through me, solid and unbroken. My phone buzzed in my purse. It was Ruth. For the first time in months, I didn't flinch when I saw her name. I answered. Her voice came sharp, breathless, already aware of the shift. "Mother, what have you done?" she demanded. "The bank called. They said you changed everything. You're making a mistake." I let the silence stretch before answering. "No, Ruth," I said softly. "I'm correcting one." She laughed bitterly. "You think you can just erase me?" I looked at the traffic moving lazily down the street, at the sun glinting on car roofs, at a child eating ice cream without a care in the world. "You erased yourself," I said. "I only stopped pretending it didn't happen." Her tone changed then, the sharp edges melting into panic. "You don't understand. I did all this for you, to protect you. You're not thinking clearly." The words that once would have pierced me now fell flat. "I'm thinking clearer than I ever have," I said. "And I forgive you, Ruth." She gasped, as if the word were an insult. "You don't get to forgive me," she said. "You're ruining everything." "No," I said, and this time my voice was steady, almost kind. "I'm saving what's left." There was a long silence, then the dull click of the line disconnecting. I stood there a while longer, holding the phone loosely in my hand, feeling the weight of everything I hadn't said, and realizing I didn't need to anymore. That evening, I returned to the motel, packed my things, and checked out. There was nothing left for me there. I took a taxi to the senior co-op Clara had recommended, a modest building with red brick walls and a courtyard full of flowering trees. The manager, a cheerful woman named Donna, showed me a small apartment on the second floor. It had a kitchenette, a narrow balcony, and a window that caught the sunset just right. "It's quiet here," she said. "You'll like it." I did. I signed the lease with the same pen I'd used at the notary, the one that had recorded Ruth's false kindness and my true voice. As night fell, I unpacked my few belongings. The blue folder went into the drawer beside the bed, the photograph of Lila on the nightstand, the ring on the chain around my neck. I made tea and sat by the open window, listening to the faint rustle of leaves. The air smelled faintly of rain, and for the first time in years, I felt no need to measure my breath. I thought of Ruth, alone in that immaculate house, surrounded by things she couldn't use, paperwork that no longer meant anything, the silence she had built finally turning against her. I didn't feel vengeful. What I felt was distance, clean, merciful distance. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing again. A new message, not from Ruth this time, but from Lila. "Grandma," Mom called. "I don't understand what's going on. Are you okay?" I smiled at the words, the worry tucked between them. "I'm better than okay," I typed back. "I'll explain everything soon. Maybe you can visit." A few seconds later came her reply. "I'll come this weekend. I love you." I stared at the screen until the letters blurred, then set the phone down and leaned back, closing my eyes. There, in the small hush of that room, I felt something shift inside me. The anger, the humiliation, the fear, they were still there, but they no longer owned me. They had been converted into something else, something steady and human. I realized that revenge had never been my goal. What I wanted, what I had always wanted, was to be seen as a person again, not as a patient, not as an inheritance, not as a burden. That was the victory, the quiet reclamation of self. Later, before bed, I opened the window wider and looked out at the night sky. The stars were faint against the city's haze, but one glimmered bright above the rooftops, stubborn and unashamed. I whispered a small prayer, not to any god, but to the version of myself that had survived. "You did it. You walked out. You're breathing." The oxygen tank hissed softly beside me, not as a reminder of weakness, but as proof of endurance. I turned off the lamp, lay back, and let the darkness settle around me like a blessing. When morning came, I woke to birdsong and sunlight pouring through the window, and for a brief, perfect moment, I forgot to reach for the mask. The air entered easily, unmeasured, mine alone. That was the real climax, not the legal papers or the confrontation, but this simple, unassisted breath, drawn without permission, released without fear. The days that followed unfolded with the gentleness of something newly healed, tender yet sure of its own resilience. The rhythm of my life shifted from survival to living, and it surprised me how simple the adjustment was once the noise of fear was gone. The small apartment filled slowly with the scent of lavender detergent and the hum of my own routines, tea steeping, the kettle whistling, the creak of the balcony chair when I sat to read in the afternoons. There was no one to tell me when to eat or sleep, no footsteps on the stairs, no whispers through closed doors. The silence here was not a threat, but a companion, spacious and honest. I began to learn what quiet sounded like when it wasn't laced with control. I kept a small notebook by the window, the same way I used to keep patient charts, though now the entries were softer, more forgiving. I wrote down things that made me feel alive: the color of the sky after rain, the way the old man across the courtyard sang off key when he watered his plants, the faint sweetness of warm bread from the bakery below. Every line was proof that I had not vanished, that I existed beyond the labels that had nearly replaced me. At first, my handwriting was shaky, but it grew steadier each day, and by the end of the week, it looked like the script I remembered from my nursing days: assertive, tidy, alive. Lila arrived on Saturday, her hair tangled from the wind, her eyes wide with worry that melted the moment she saw me standing in the doorway. She ran into my arms, and for a long time we said nothing, just held each other, breathing the same air, the same relief. "You look beautiful, Grandma," she whispered, and I laughed, the sound startling us both. We spent the afternoon together, drinking tea, talking about her studies, her plans, her life. When she finally asked about Ruth, I chose my words carefully. "Your mother and I see the world differently now," I said, "but I wish her peace." Lila nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. "She's been angry," she said. "She doesn't understand." "She doesn't have to," I replied. "Understanding is a kind of grace, and not everyone is ready for grace at the same time." Before she left, Lila took my hands and said, "You're the bravest person I know." I wanted to tell her that bravery wasn't what saved me. It was clarity, the slow realization that love without respect is a cage. But I only smiled and told her to keep her heart open, but not unguarded. After she left, I sat by the window again and watched her walk down the street, her figure growing smaller until she turned the corner and disappeared. I felt no sadness, only a quiet fullness, the way the sea must feel after the tide has gone out, emptied yet complete. In the evenings, I started going downstairs to sit with the other residents in the courtyard. We were an unlikely congregation of survivors, widows, retirees, men who had outlived their brothers, women who had been caretakers until their own hands trembled too much to serve. We shared small things: soup recipes, memories of long-closed dance halls, complaints about the cost of medication. But beneath the surface, there was a shared language of endurance. We had all been erased in one way or another, and we had all learned how to write ourselves back into the world. I didn't tell them the full story, only fragments, shaped like parables. Sometimes, I said once, as we watched the sun dip behind the buildings, the people who claim to protect you are the ones you need to protect yourself from. They nodded, not asking for details. They understood. Every few weeks, Ruth would call. I never answered, but I listened to the voicemails. The first ones were angry, full of accusation. The next were quieter, threaded with confusion. And then, months later, one came that began simply with, "Mom." Her voice was small, unsteady. "I don't know how to talk to you anymore. I hope you're okay." I didn't delete that one. I didn't return it either. Forgiveness, I'd learned, doesn't always require reconciliation. Sometimes it's enough to let the wound breathe without picking at it. Seasons changed, and with them my lungs grew both weaker and wiser. Some days, walking to the window took effort, but I did it anyway, refusing to let the air feel like charity. On those days, I remembered the sentence she once said, "Let her gasp," and I found myself almost grateful for it, because it had burned away everything false, leaving behind only what was real. Survival can be cruel that way. It purifies by fire. I kept the oxygen tank by my bed still, but it had become something else, a symbol, a witness, a reminder that breath can be both weapon and prayer. One morning, as the sun poured gold across the floor, I took out the blue folder one last time. I spread its contents on the table, the notarized revocations, the bank letters, the will in Lila's name, the faded note from Ruth that read, "Please rest." I looked at them not as trophies, but as proof that even the most invisible lives can rewrite their own endings. I placed them all back neatly, sealed the folder, and wrote on its cover in large, looping letters, "Essie Harlow, still here." Then I tucked it away in the drawer and left it there, knowing I would not need to open it again. That evening, I brewed a pot of chamomile tea and carried it to the balcony. The sky was streaked with the pink of an early autumn sunset, and a light wind moved through the trees, making the leaves whisper like old friends sharing secrets. I closed my eyes and listened to the city's heartbeat below. Cars, laughter, the distant rhythm of music, and felt a kind of peace that was not passive, but earned. The air filled my lungs easily, and for once, I didn't count the seconds between inhales. I thought then of all the women who never get to this point, who live out their days muted by fear, who believe that endurance is the same as love. I wished I could tell each of them what I had learned, that dignity is not given, it is reclaimed, sometimes breath by breath. If anyone ever listens to this story, if some other woman hears it whispered through her own silence, I hope she understands what I mean when I say, they can take your comfort, your home, even your name for a while, but as long as you draw air by your own will, you are not theirs to own. When the first stars appeared, I whispered a small prayer to the night, for all of us who refused to die quietly. The city lights answered with a shimmer, and the air moved gently against my face, cool and kind. I lifted the cup of tea to my lips and let its warmth linger, feeling the pulse in my wrist, the slow, steady proof of life. I had walked out of that house with nothing but my breath, and that had been enough. It was still enough.